Marcus Chen had grease under his fingernails and hope in his heart when he first stepped aboard the Obsidian Crown, flagship of the Draconian Empire. The massive vessel stretched for kilometers, its biomechanical hull pulsing with veins of molten energy that powered technologies beyond human understanding. To most beings in the galaxy, humans were still the new kids. Barely 3 centuries since first contact, still learning which fork to use at diplomatic dinners. But Marcus didn't care about politics or protocols. He cared about engines, and the Draconian fleet had the most beautiful engines in known space. The workshop assigned to him was a cramped corner of Engineering Bay 12, sandwiched between 2 massive coolant processors that hummed with enough power to level a city block. Other species got the premium workspace. The tall, elegant Etherians with their crystalline tools, the methodical Gorthak with their precision instruments. Humans got the leftovers. Marcus made those leftovers sing. Within his first week, he had diagnosed a resonance issue in the port stabilizer that had puzzled the senior Etherian engineers for months. A simple harmonic damper constructed from spare parts and human intuition solved a problem that had cost the fleet millions in efficiency losses. Word traveled fast in the cramped quarters of a starship, even one as massive as the Obsidian Crown. The Dragon Empress herself noticed on the 47th day. Seraphina Drakthul stood 3 meters tall when she chose to, though Marcus had heard she could shift her form at will. Her scales shifted from deep emerald to molten gold depending on her mood, and her eyes held the accumulated wisdom and cruelty of 8 centuries. When she entered Engineering Bay 12, the ambient temperature rose 5 degrees, and every piece of electronic equipment briefly hummed in harmonic resonance with her presence. Marcus was elbow-deep in a quantum coupling assembly when her shadow fell across his workbench. He looked up, wrench still in hand, and found himself staring into eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "Human," her voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. "You are the one they call the problem solver." It wasn't a question. Marcus set down his wrench carefully and wiped his hands on his coveralls. The pendant around his neck, a simple thing of tarnished silver and blue stone, caught the light as he straightened. "Just doing my job, Your Imperial Majesty." Seraphina's gaze fixed on the pendant, and something shifted in her expression. The golden hue of her scales deepened, taking on an almost hungry quality. "That bauble you wear, it is interesting." Marcus's hand moved instinctively to cover the pendant. It was a reflexive gesture, one born of 26 years of protecting the only thing he had left of his mother. "It was my mother's." "Was?" The Dragon Empress stepped closer, and Marcus caught the scent of ozone and ancient fire. "She has passed beyond the veil?" "When I was 12. The words came out steady, though Marcus felt the familiar ache that accompanied any mention of Elena Chen. "Mining accident on Europa Station." Seraphina's eyes narrowed, but not with anger, with something that might have been recognition. Her massive hand, each finger tipped with claws that could shear through reinforced steel, gestured toward the pendant. "I would examine it more closely." The words carried the weight of absolute authority. In the Draconian Empire, the Empress's requests were not truly requests at all. Marcus had seen what happened to those who disappointed her. Summary execution was considered a mercy compared to her more creative punishments. But as her hand extended toward him, something in Marcus rebelled. Not against her authority, not against the power that could snuff out his life with a thought, but against the idea of losing the last piece of his mother. His own hand tightened around the pendant, and he met those ancient eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both. "No." The single word dropped into the sudden silence like a stone into still water. Every being in the engineering bay froze, their various forms of breathing ceasing as they waited for the inevitable explosion of draconic fury. The temperature spiked another 10 degrees. Serafina blinked slowly, as if she couldn't quite process what she had heard. "Did you just refuse me?" "That pendant was my mother's," Marcus repeated, his voice gaining strength. "And with respect, Your Imperial Majesty, that makes it mine. Not yours to examine, not yours to take, not yours to even touch without my permission." The Dragon Empress drew herself up to her full height, scales now blazing with such intensity that several nearby instruments began registering dangerous heat levels. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the ship's hull itself vibrate. "I am Serafina Drakthul, Empress of 12 star systems, commander of fleets that could reduce your homeworld to cosmic dust. I have seen the birth and death of species. I have held the beating hearts of gods in my hands." Her eyes blazed like twin suns. "And you, little human, would dare tell me no?" Marcus should have backed down. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to apologize, to grovel, to hand over the pendant and beg for forgiveness. Instead, he found himself thinking about his mother's laugh, about the way she used to hum while she worked, about the stories she told him of Earth's ancient heroes who stood firm in the face of impossible odds. "Yes," he said simply. "I would." For a moment that stretched like eternity, dragon and human stared at each other across a gulf of species, power, and understanding. Then Serafina did something that shocked everyone present, including herself. She laughed. It started as a low rumble in her chest, building to a sound like distant avalanches. Several nearby engineers, 3 Etherians and a Gorthak, actually fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the harmonic resonance of draconic amusement. "Fascinating," Serafina murmured when her laughter subsided. "Absolutely fascinating. Tell me, little engineer, what makes this trinket so precious that you would risk my wrath to keep it?" Marcus felt something shift in the conversation. The immediate threat had passed, replaced by something that might have been curiosity. He relaxed his grip on the pendant, though he didn't remove his hand entirely. "It's all I have left of her," he said. "When the mine collapsed on Europa, they found this in her personal effects. She was the best person I ever knew. Brilliant engineer, kind heart, never gave up on anything or anyone." He paused, surprised by how easily the words came. "When I hold this, I remember her voice. I remember the way she believed people could be better than they were." Serafina's scales had shifted again, taking on deeper, more contemplative hues. And what did this paragon of virtue do, that her memory should be worth defying an empress? "She fixed things," Marcus said. "Not just machines, though she was the best engineer in the Sol system. She fixed people, situations, problems that everyone else said were impossible." He managed a small smile. "Kind of like what I've been doing here, I guess." "Indeed." The Dragon Empress circled him slowly, and Marcus had the uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated by a predator. "Your record aboard my ship has been noteworthy. 7 major repairs that my senior staff deemed impossible. 3 efficiency improvements that have saved the fleet significant resources. And now this, a display of principle that borders on madness." She stopped directly in front of him again, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her scales. "I begin to see why the other species speak of humans with such puzzlement. You are not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most intelligent, but you possess something that pure power cannot replicate." "What's that?" "Stubbornness." The word came out with another rumble of amusement. "Magnificent, illogical, sometimes fatal stubbornness. You will stand against impossible odds for the sake of principle, even when surrender would be wiser." Marcus couldn't argue with that assessment. His mother had always said it was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. Serafina stepped back, and the temperature in the bay began to return to normal. "Very well, little human, keep your pendant. But know this, I do not forget such displays of character. We shall speak again." She turned to go, then paused at the bay entrance. "Oh, and Marcus Chen?" "Yes? Your Imperial Majesty? The next time you address me, you will use my name. You have earned that privilege." Her eyes glittered with something that might have been respect. "Few beings can claim to have surprised me twice in a single conversation." After she left, Marcus realized his hands were shaking. He'd just defied the most powerful being in known space and lived to tell about it. Around him, the other engineers slowly returned to their work, shooting him glances that ranged from admiration to terror. He looked down at the pendant in his hand, tarnished silver and a blue stone that seemed to hold depths he'd never noticed before. His mother's pendant, his protection against the vast, uncaring universe. For the first time, he wondered if there might be more to it than just sentiment. That night, alone in his tiny quarters, Marcus pulled out the one photo he had of his mother. Elena Chen smiled back at him, her eyes bright with the joy of discovery. She wore the pendant in the photo, and Marcus noticed something he'd never seen before, the way the blue stone seemed to catch and hold the light, almost as if it were generating its own subtle glow. He held the pendant up to the light, studying it more carefully than he had in years. The silver wasn't tarnished at all, he realized. It was actually a metal he didn't recognize, one that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury frozen in time. And the blue stone. The blue stone pulsed once, very softly, and Marcus felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature spread through his chest. Somewhere else on the ship, in quarters that occupied an entire deck and were decorated with the treasures of 100 worlds, the dragon Empress stared out at the stars and tried to understand what she had just experienced. In 800 years of existence, very few beings had surprised her. Fewer still had earned her respect through defiance. But it wasn't just the human's stubborn courage that intrigued her. It was the pendant he wore, and the way it had seemed to resonate with something deep in her draconic senses. She had felt that resonance only once before, centuries ago, when she was young and the galaxy was full of mysteries yet to be explored. A memory stirred, one she had buried beneath layers of conquest and political necessity. A world called Earth. A woman with eyes like starlight and a voice like singing crystal. A promise made and a debt that had never been repaid. Serafina closed her eyes and let the memory surface fully. When it did, she smiled, an expression that would have terrified her enemies and confused her allies. "Elena," she whispered to the stars, "your son has his mother's fire, it seems, and perhaps it is time to honor old promises." In his quarters, Marcus Chen slept fitfully, his dreams filled with distant thunder and the sound of his mother's laughter. The pendant rested against his chest, warm and quietly alive, carrying secrets that neither of them yet understood. But understanding would come, as it always did in stories where ordinary people discovered they were connected to extraordinary things. And when it did, the galaxy itself might never be the same. 3 weeks after his confrontation with the Dragon Empress, Marcus discovered that earning her respect came with unexpected complications. The first sign was the upgrade to his quarters. He returned from a 14-hour shift in the engine bays to find his belongings moved to a suite that was larger than most apartments on Earth. The second sign was the access codes. Suddenly, doors that had been sealed to human personnel opened at his approach. The third, and most unsettling sign, was the way other crew members now looked at him with mixtures of fear, envy, and something approaching reverence. "You don't understand what you've done," whispered Carix, an Etherian engineer whose crystalline form shimmered with anxiety. She hasn't taken a personal interest in anyone for 70 years. The last being she favored. He couldn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Marcus tried to return to normalcy, but normal had become a foreign concept. When he solved a complex power distribution problem that had plagued the ship for months, word reached the Empress within hours. When he jury-rigged a replacement part for a critical navigation system using spare cafeteria equipment, she actually visited the bay to examine his work personally. "Ingenious," she murmured, running one clawed finger along the makeshift component. "Your species' gift for improvisation continues to amaze me. Tell me, Marcus, where did you learn such techniques?" "My mother," he replied automatically, then caught himself. Using her name, as she'd instructed, still felt strange. "I mean, my mother taught me, Serafina. She always said that good engineering wasn't about having the perfect parts. It was about understanding what you really needed and finding a way to make it work." Something flickered in the Dragon Empress's eyes. "Wise words. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. Marcus touched the pendant unconsciously, a habit he'd developed whenever his mother came up in conversation. "She could fix anything. Used to say that every problem had a solution if you just looked at it from the right angle." Serafina's gaze followed his hand to the pendant, and Marcus saw her expression shift, just slightly, but enough to catch his attention. There was something there, some flicker of recognition or memory that she quickly suppressed. "This pendant of yours," she said carefully, "you mentioned it was found in your mother's effects. Do you know where she acquired it?" Marcus frowned. "She never said. I just assumed it was something she'd had since before I was born." "Why?" "Curiosity." The word came out too quickly, and Marcus's engineer's instincts, the same ones that could detect a failing component from the sound of its harmonics, told him there was more to it than that. Before he could ask follow-up questions, an alarm began echoing through the ship. Emergency klaxons were followed by the voice of Commander Zephys, the ship's Gorthak, second in command. "All hands to battle stations. Unknown vessels approaching from hyperspace. Imperial codes invalid." Serafina's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The conversational Dragon Empress vanished, replaced by 800 years of military command. "Return to your station, Marcus. Ensure all engineering systems are operating at peak efficiency." She was already moving toward the exit. "We will continue this discussion later." Marcus watched her go, then looked down at his pendant. In the red emergency lighting, the blue stone seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, a steady beat that reminded him of a heartbeat or perhaps the deep thrum of a ship's engines under stress. The battle, when it came, was unlike anything in Marcus's limited experience. The Obsidian Crown was attacked by a fleet of ships he didn't recognize, sleek, angular vessels that moved with predatory grace and fired weapons that seemed to bend space itself. From his position in the engineering bay, he could only hear the fight through status reports and the ship's defensive systems cycling through power configurations he'd never seen before. "Hull breach on Deck 17, announced the ship's AI. "Atmospheric containment holding. Direct hit to port shields. Shield strength at 63% and falling. Unknown energy signature detected. Analyzing." Marcus divided his attention between keeping the engines running smoothly and monitoring the pendant. As the battle intensified, the blue stone's glow grew brighter, pulsing in sync with what he was beginning to realize was the ship's defensive grid. Then, something impossible happened. One of the attacking vessels slipped past the Obsidian Crown's shields and fired directly at the engineering section. Marcus watched the energy beam streak toward his bay through the external cameras, knowing that in seconds, he and half the engineering crew would be vaporized. The pendant grew blazing hot against his chest. Without conscious thought, Marcus grabbed it and held it up. The blue stone flared with brilliant light, and the attacking beam stopped. Not deflected, not absorbed, simply stopped, as if it had encountered an immovable barrier just meters from the hull. The light faded, and Marcus stared at the Pendant in shock. Around him, the other engineers were picking themselves up from where they'd taken cover, looking around in confusion. "What just happened?" demanded Chief Engineer Grothak, his four arms gesturing wildly. "The readings show the beam should have penetrated the hull." Marcus said nothing. He couldn't explain what had happened because he didn't understand it himself. The Pendant had grown warm before, but nothing like this. Nothing that could affect energy weapons or shield entire sections of a ship. The battle ended 20 minutes later when Seraphina herself took to space in her dragon form and systematically destroyed 3 of the attacking vessels while the others fled. Marcus had heard stories of her combat prowess, but had never witnessed it firsthand. Even through the ship's sensors, the sight of a 300-meter dragon breathing coherent plasma was enough to make him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the balance of power in the galaxy. She returned in a foul mood, her scales still glowing with residual heat from her exertions. Marcus was summoned to her private chambers, a first, and one that had several crew members making what sounded like farewell gestures as he left. The Dragon Empress's quarters were exactly what he expected. Opulent beyond measure, filled with artifacts from across the galaxy, dominated by a platform that could accommodate her full size. What he didn't expect was to find her in human form, pacing back and forth with barely contained fury. In human shape, Seraphina stood about 2 meters tall, with dark hair that held hints of gold and green. Her skin had a subtle scaled texture that caught the light, and her eyes retained their inhuman depth. She was, Marcus had to admit, strikingly beautiful in a way that suggested barely contained danger. "The Void Cult!" she snarled without preamble. "They should not have been able to penetrate this deep into Imperial space. Their ships, their weapons—" She turned to face him. "Something has changed. They are more powerful than before." Marcus wasn't sure why she was telling him this, but he listened carefully. The Void Cult was legendary, fanatics who worshipped the spaces between stars and sought to return the galaxy to primordial darkness. They'd been quiet for decades. "But that is not why I summoned you," Seraphina continued. She approached him slowly, her gaze fixed on the Pendant. "During the battle, sensors detected an energy surge from the engineering bay, an energy surge that corresponded exactly with the failure of a Void Cult weapon to penetrate our hull." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd hoped the incident had gone unnoticed, but apparently the Dragon Empress noticed everything aboard her ship. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Don't." Her voice carried a warning that made his bones vibrate. "Do not insult my intelligence with lies, Marcus Chen. That pendant of yours is not the simple memorial you believe it to be. It is far older, far more powerful than you know." She moved to a wall display and gestured. An image appeared, a star map showing a blue-white sun with several planets. "Kepler 442b, she said, "a world your people have never visited, located in what you call the Lyra constellation. Once, long ago, it was home to a species known as the Ancients." The map zoomed in, showing a planet that gleamed like a sapphire. Cities of impossible beauty rose from continents that seemed to pulse with their own light. "The Ancients were the first species to achieve true immortality," Seraphina continued. "Not through technology or genetic manipulation, but through harmony with the fundamental forces of reality itself. They could shape matter and energy with thought alone, travel between stars without ships, communicate across galactic distances instantaneously." Marcus stared at the images, feeling a strange resonance in his chest. The Pendant was growing warm again, responding to something he couldn't identify. "What happened to them?" "They vanished." The images shifted, showing the same planet but dead, empty, scoured clean of all life. 3 million years ago, they simply left. Some say they ascended to a higher plane of existence. Others believe they were destroyed by forces beyond our understanding. Her eyes fixed on his pendant. But they left artifacts behind. Items that retained fragments of their power. Items that could recognize and respond to specific genetic signatures. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. You're saying my mother was descended from these ancients? Not descended from, Serafina said softly. Elena Chen was not human. The words hung in the air like a challenge to reality itself. Marcus felt the world tilt around him, his understanding of everything he thought he knew crumbling. That's impossible. I saw her birth records, her genetic profiles. She was human, born on Earth in New Geneva. False. Serafina gestured again, and new images appeared. Documents, medical scans, genetic analyses. She was found as an infant in the wreckage of an unidentified ship that crashed in the Swiss Alps in 2387. The couple who found her, the Chens, were kind people who had lost their own child. They created false documentation and raised her as their own. Marcus sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed. You're telling me my mother was an alien? Not alien, Serafina corrected. Something far more significant. Elena was the last known survivor of the ancients, hidden away on a backwater world and raised by humans who never knew what they had found. She paused, studying his reaction. Which means, Marcus Chen, that you carry their bloodline in your veins. The pendant pulsed once, strongly, as if confirming her words. Marcus looked down at it, seeing it with new eyes. Not just his mother's memorial, but a fragment of a civilization that had mastered reality itself. How do you know all this? He asked. For the first time since he'd met her, Serafina looked uncomfortable. She turned away, staring out at the stars beyond her viewports. Because, she said quietly, I knew your mother. We met 70 years ago, when she was working as an engineer on a deep space monitoring station. I was younger then, less concerned with the responsibilities of empire. I spent time among the lesser species, learning about their cultures, their ways of thinking. Marcus felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. You and she. We were friends, Serafina said firmly, though something in her tone suggested the relationship had been more complex than friendship. She was brilliant, kind, curious about everything. She had a way of looking at problems that made the impossible seem simple, and she wore that pendant, though she never knew its true significance. Why didn't you tell her? I tried. For the first time, the Dragon Empress sounded genuinely pained. But Elena was happy in her ignorance. She had found love with your father, was building a life among humans. When I attempted to explain what she truly was, she rejected the knowledge. She wanted to remain Elena Chen, human engineer, rather than become something larger and lonelier. Marcus absorbed this, trying to reconcile the image of his warm, loving mother with the idea of an ancient survivor. Is that why she died in the mining accident? Because she didn't know what she was? Serafina's scales shifted to darker hues. There was no mining accident. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. What? The Void Cult found her. They have been searching for ancient artifacts for millennia, believing that by destroying the last remnants of that species, they can hasten the galaxy's return to primordial darkness. Serafina's voice turned deadly quiet. They murdered her, Marcus, and now they have found you. Marcus stood slowly, his mind reeling. Everything he had believed about his life, his mother's death, his own identity, all of it was built on lies and half-truths. That's why they attacked the ship, he said. They weren't after you. They were after me. Yes. The pendant you wear is not merely a memorial. It is a beacon. As you grow into your heritage, as your abilities begin to manifest, it broadcasts your location to those who know how to look for such signals. Seraphina turned back to him, and her eyes held centuries of regret. I should have claimed you years ago, when you were still a child. Should have brought you here and trained you properly. Instead, I let sentiment cloud my judgment, allowed you to live as a human because it was what Elena would have wanted. And now? Now you have a choice. She gestured toward the pendant. You can continue as you are. Human, mortal, limited, but safe in your ignorance. I can have the pendant's power suppressed, make you invisible to those who hunt you. You could live out a normal human lifespan in peace. Or, Seraphina's smile held both promise and threat. Or you can embrace what you truly are. Learn to use the power that flows in your blood. Become something greater than human, greater than any single species in this galaxy. Her eyes blazed. Help me hunt down the cult that murdered your mother and make them pay for every life they have taken. Marcus looked down at the pendant, feeling its steady pulse against his palm. For the first time, he let himself really listen to what it was telling him. The warmth, the occasional flashes of impossible knowledge, the way it had deflected the energy weapon. All of it made sense now. His mother had died protecting the secret of what he was. She had chosen to be human rather than claim her birthright as one of the ancients. But she had also given him the tools he would need if he ever chose differently. When he looked up, his eyes held a determination that reminded Seraphina powerfully of Elena. Teach me, Marcus said simply. Show me how to use this power. Show me how to make them pay. The Dragon Empress smiled, and for the first time in centuries, it was the expression of pure joy. Welcome to your inheritance, Marcus Chen. Let us begin. Training with a dragon, Marcus discovered, was nothing like the stories made it seem. For one thing, Seraphina was a meticulous teacher, breaking down complex concepts into digestible pieces with the patience of someone who had spent centuries mastering the art of instruction. For another, learning to access ancient abilities while maintaining his human identity proved far more challenging than either of them had anticipated. The power is not separate from you, Seraphina explained during their 5th session in her private training chamber. It is woven into the very fabric of your being. You cannot simply turn it on and off like one of your machines. Marcus sat cross-legged on the chamber floor, the pendant resting in his open palm. Around him, holographic displays showed energy patterns that shifted and flowed like living things. For the past week, he had been learning to sense the currents of power that moved through the ship, the galaxy, the very cosmos itself. I can feel it, he said, eyes closed in concentration. Like background music that you don't notice until someone points it out. But every time I try to actually use it, you think like a human, Seraphina said, not unkindly. You approach it as an engineering problem to be solved, a system to be understood and controlled. But ancient power does not work that way. It requires harmony, not dominance, partnership, not mastery. Marcus opened his eyes, frustrated. Then how did my mother use it? She thought like a human, too. Elena never truly accessed her heritage, Seraphina admitted. The pendant responded to her emotions, her needs, but she never learned to consciously direct its abilities. When she died, the Dragon Empress paused, scales shifting to deeper, sadder hues. When she died, she was defending a group of miners who had been trapped by the collapse. The pendant's power held the tunnel stable long enough for rescue teams to reach them, even as the cult's assassins closed in. The image of his mother, alone and desperate, using power she didn't understand, to save strangers while facing certain death, hit Marcus harder than any physical blow. He looked down at the pendant, seeing not just an artifact, but a legacy of sacrifice and heroism. She could have saved herself, he said quietly. Yes, but that was not who Elena was. She chose to be human in all the ways that mattered: the nobility, the compassion, the willingness to sacrifice for others. Serafina knelt beside him, her human form radiating the same warmth as her dragon shape. Those qualities are not weaknesses to be overcome, Marcus. They are the source of your true power. That night, alone in his quarters, Marcus dreamed. He stood in a city of impossible beauty, where towers of living light reached toward stars that seemed close enough to touch. Around him, beings of pure energy moved through the air, their forms shifting between solid matter and dancing flame. They were the ancients as they had been at their height, immortal, wise, masters of reality itself. But as he watched, he saw something that chilled him. For all their power, for all their mastery over the fundamental forces of existence, the ancients were alone. They floated through their perfect city without touching, communicated in harmonics too pure for warmth, created wonders that no one could truly share or appreciate. "They had everything," said a voice behind him, "except what matters most." Marcus turned to find his mother standing there, exactly as he remembered her. Laugh lines around her eyes, grease stains on her coveralls, the pendant glowing softly at her throat. "Mom." His voice came out choked with emotion. Elena smiled and reached out to touch his face. Her hand felt real, warm, alive. "My brilliant boy, you're growing into something wonderful. I don't understand any of this. The power, what I'm supposed to become, what it all means." "The ancients forgot something important," Elena said gently. "They became so focused on transcending their limitations that they lost touch with what made them worth preserving in the first place. Their connections to each other, their ability to love and sacrifice and hope." She gestured toward the empty city around them. "In the end, they didn't ascend to a higher plane. They simply faded away, became so removed from physical existence that they forgot why existence mattered." Marcus looked around at the lifeless perfection surrounding them. "Is that what I'm becoming?" "That depends on you." Elena took his hands in hers, and the pendant between them blazed with warm light. "You have a choice, Marcus. You can follow their path, become something transcendent and alone and ultimately meaningless. Or you can forge a new path. Use their power, but keep your humanity. Be an ancient who remembers what it means to be mortal." "How?" His mother's smile held all the love he remembered. "The same way you've always solved impossible problems. You look at them from a different angle. You find a way to make broken things work." She stepped back, beginning to fade. "Remember, my son, you were never just human, but you were never just ancient either. You are something new, something better. You are the bridge between what was and what could be." Marcus woke with the dream burning bright in his memory and the pendant warm against his chest. For the first time since his training began, he thought he understood what Serafina had been trying to teach him. The understanding came just in time. 3 days later, the Void cult found them again. This time they came in force, not just ships, but something far worse. As alarms echoed through the obsidian crown, Marcus raced to the bridge to find Serafina in her dragon form, too large for the command center, but projected as a hologram that crackled with barely contained fury. "Report!" she snarled at Commander Zephys. The Gorthak's 4 arms danced over multiple control panels simultaneously. "Long-range sensors detect a massive gravitational anomaly approaching from the galactic south. It's consuming everything in its path." On the main screen, an image resolved that defied comprehension. It looked like a hole in space itself, a sphere of absolute nothingness that devoured light, matter, and even the fabric of reality. Around its edges, the distorted remains of star systems spiraled into oblivion. "A void sphere," Seraphina whispered, and for the first time since Marcus had known her, the Dragon Empress sounded afraid. "They have awakened a void sphere." "What is that?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be terrible. "The ultimate weapon of the void cult," Seraphina replied. "They believe that existence itself is an aberration, a flaw in the perfect emptiness that preceded the Big Bang. The void spheres are their attempt to return the universe to that state of nothingness." Her holographic form flickered with stress. "I have only seen one before, and it took the combined fleets of 7 species to contain it. Even then, we barely succeeded." Marcus stared at the approaching doom and felt something crystallize in his mind. The pendant grew warm against his chest, and suddenly he could sense the void sphere's true nature. Not just a weapon, but a wound in reality itself. A place where the fundamental forces that held existence together had been deliberately severed. "How long before it reaches us?" he asked. "At current velocity, approximately 6 hours, Zephys reported. "Long enough to evacuate the crew to the escape pods, but—" "We're not running," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised everyone, including himself. "We're going to stop it." Seraphina's hologram turned to stare at him. "Marcus, a void sphere cannot be destroyed by conventional weapons. It exists by negating the very forces that make energy and matter possible. To stop it would require someone who can manipulate those fundamental forces directly," Marcus finished. "Someone with ancient abilities." Understanding dawned in the Dragon Empress's eyes, followed immediately by horror. "No, absolutely not. Even if you had full control of your heritage, which you do not, the attempt would kill you. Elena would never forgive me if I allowed—" "My mother is dead," Marcus said quietly, but with steel beneath the words. "Murdered by the same cult that created this thing. How many worlds are in its path? How many billions of lives will be snuffed out if we don't try?" He could see the calculations running behind Seraphina's eyes. Evacuation times, fleet positions, the political and military ramifications of losing an imperial flagship. But he could also see something else, something that reminded him powerfully of his mother's expression when she talked about fixing impossible problems. "There is a theoretical possibility," Seraphina said slowly. "If you could synchronize your abilities with the ship's power core, use the entire vessel as a focusing array." She trailed off, shaking her massive head. "But the power requirements would be astronomical, and the feedback would destroy both you and the ship." Marcus smiled, and for a moment, he looked exactly like Elena Chen, facing down another impossible challenge. "Then it's a good thing I'm an engineer. I don't fix things by using the perfect parts, Seraphina. I fix them by understanding what they really need and finding a way to make it work." The next 5 hours passed in a blur of preparation that would have seemed impossible under any other circumstances. Marcus worked with a precision and clarity he had never possessed before, as if his mother's engineering genius and his ancient heritage had finally found perfect harmony. He started by modifying the ship's power distribution network, rerouting energy conduits in patterns that followed the geometric principles he was beginning to understand intuitively. The pendant served as both guide and amplifier, its ancient technology interfacing seamlessly with draconian engineering. But it was more than just technical work. Marcus found himself drawing on every relationship he had built aboard the ship, every favor he had earned through months of quietly solving impossible problems. Carix and the other Etherian engineers worked alongside him without question, their crystalline forms singing in harmony as they aligned quantum resonators. The Gorthak technical crew contributed their methodical precision, ensuring that every connection was perfect. Even the usually aloof hegemony observers pitched in, recognizing that extinction was a remarkably effective motivator for cooperation. And through it all, Seraphina was there, not as the terrifying dragon empress, but as a friend who had loved his mother and now feared for his life. She coordinated the evacuation of non-essential personnel while simultaneously running probability calculations on his plan. "The mathematics are disturbing," she admitted during a brief break. "In theory, it could work, but the margin for error is non-existent. If you miscalculate by even a fraction of a percent—" "I won't," Marcus said simply. "This is what I was born for, Seraphina. This is why my mother died protecting people instead of using her power to save herself. This is why she raised me to understand that being strong means choosing to help others, even when it costs you everything." As the void sphere approached, Marcus made his way to the ship's central core, a chamber that housed the primary fusion reactor and the gravitational stabilizers that kept the massive vessel from tearing itself apart. He had modified it extensively, turning it into something that was part machine, part ancient artifact, and part expression of pure will. The pendant, now removed from around his neck, rested in a specially designed housing at the center of the array. Energy patterns flowed around it like living things, and Marcus could feel the ship itself becoming an extension of his consciousness. "All non-essential personnel have been evacuated," Seraphina reported over the communications system. Her voice was carefully controlled, but Marcus could hear the emotion beneath it. "Marcus, if there was any other way—" "I know," he said softly, "but this is the right way. This is what she would have done." Through the ship's sensors, he could see the void sphere now, a sphere of absolute nothingness, perhaps 1,000 kilometers in diameter, surrounded by the twisted wreckage of everything it had consumed. At its heart lay a darkness so complete that it seemed to pull at his soul just to look at it. Marcus placed his hands on the control interface and opened himself fully to his ancient heritage for the first time. The power that flowed through him was indescribable. He felt himself expanding beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone, his consciousness spreading through the ship, through the surrounding space, touching the very foundations of reality. For a terrifying moment, he understood why the ancients had ultimately faded away. It would be so easy to let go, to become pure energy and thought, to transcend the messy complications of physical existence. But then he thought of his mother's laugh, of the miners she had died saving, of the billions of lives that hung in the balance. He thought of Seraphina's unexpected friendship, of Carix's nervous chittering when he was worried, of all the small connections and relationships that made existence worth preserving. The void sphere struck the ship's enhanced shields with a force that should have annihilated them instantly. Instead, Marcus felt the impact as a personal assault, a negation that sought to unravel not just his body, but his very existence. Through the pendant and the ship's modified systems, he pushed back. What followed was not really a battle in any conventional sense. It was a contest between two fundamentally opposed concepts of existence. The void cult's belief that nothingness was the natural state of the universe, and Marcus's very human conviction that life, connection, and meaning were worth fighting for. The void sphere pressed forward, its impossible gravity trying to collapse the ship into a singularity. Marcus channeled every erg of power the ship could generate, shaped it through ancient principles his blood remembered even if his mind did not, and held the line. But it wasn't enough. Even with all his power, all his understanding, he could feel himself losing ground. The void sphere was simply too massive, too alien, too antithetical to everything he represented. That was when Seraphina made her choice. The Dragon Empress abandoned her human form and emerged from the ship's hangar bay in her full draconic glory. But this time, She was more than just a 300-meter flying reptile. This time, she allowed her own ancient power to manifest fully. The accumulated might of 8 centuries, the fury of a species that had ruled the stars since before humans discovered fire. She flew directly into the void sphere. Marcus felt her presence as she entered that realm of negation, felt her consciousness joining with his through the pendant's connection. 2 ancient species, 2 different approaches to transcendence, working together for the first time in millions of years. Together, Seraphina's voice echoed in his mind, carrying harmonics that spoke of love and loss and determination. For Elena. Marcus poured everything he had into the link, his engineering genius, his human stubbornness, his ancient heritage, and most importantly, his absolute refusal to let evil triumph while he still drew breath. Seraphina added her own power, but more than that, she added her centuries of experience with forces that lesser beings couldn't even comprehend. The void sphere hesitated. For the first time in its existence, it encountered something that matched its fundamental negation with equally fundamental affirmation, not just the power to destroy, but the will to create. Not just the ability to end existence, but the determination to give it meaning. And in that moment of hesitation, Marcus found the flaw he had been looking for. The void sphere wasn't truly nothingness. It was a complex construct held together by the void cult's technology and ideology. Like any system, it had stress points, failure modes, places where the wrong kind of input could cause catastrophic malfunction. Marcus had spent his entire life learning how to break things in exactly the right way. He reached through Seraphina's connection, found the quantum resonance that held the sphere's structure stable, and introduced a small but precisely targeted harmonic discord. Not an attack, but an adjustment. A tiny change in frequency that propagated through the entire system like a virus through a computer network. The void sphere began to collapse inward on itself. The implosion was spectacular, a reverse Big Bang that consumed the weapon in its own negation. Where there had been a hole in reality, now there was simply empty space, clean and ready for new stars to be born. Marcus felt himself falling, his consciousness snapping back into his human body as the pendant's power finally exceeded his ability to channel it safely. Through the ship's sensors, he saw Seraphina's dragon form tumbling through space, unconscious but alive. As rescue teams rushed to retrieve both of them, Marcus managed to smile despite the pain that racked every cell of his body. They had done it. They had saved not just the ship, but potentially billions of lives across dozens of star systems. More importantly, they had proven something that neither species had been able to demonstrate alone, that transcendence didn't require abandoning your connections to others, and that true strength came not from power over others, but from the willingness to sacrifice for them. When Marcus woke up 3 days later in the ship's medical bay, he found Seraphina sitting beside his bed in her human form. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, and her scales showing stress patterns he had never seen before. "How do you feel?" she asked. Marcus took inventory. The pendant, now hanging from a new chain around his neck, pulsed with a gentle, steady rhythm. He could still sense the ancient power in his blood, but it felt different now. Integrated, controlled, part of him rather than something separate he struggled to master. "Like I finally understand what my mother was trying to teach me," he said. "That being powerful doesn't mean being alone. That the best solutions are the ones that bring people together instead of driving them apart." Seraphina smiled, and Marcus was struck by how genuinely happy she looked. "Your mother would be proud. You have achieved something that neither the ancients nor my people managed alone. You have found a way to be transcendent without losing your connection to mortality." "We found a way," Marcus corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." The Dragon Empress was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability he had never heard from her before. Elena asked me once what I thought would happen if humans ever achieved the same level of power as the elder species. I told her that they would probably destroy themselves within a generation, as most young species do. She looked at him with eyes that held 8 centuries of accumulated wisdom. I was wrong. You have shown me that humans don't seek power for its own sake. You seek it to protect, to build, to connect. That may be the most important lesson any species can learn. Marcus smiled and settled back into his pillows. Outside the medical bay's viewport, he could see stars. Not the cold, distant points of light they had once seemed, but warm beacons of possibility. Somewhere among them were worlds that would never know how close they had come to annihilation. People who would live and love and dream, because a humble mechanic had learned to embrace both his humanity and his heritage. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of impossible problem his mother would have been proud to see him solve. "So what happens now?" he asked. Seraphina's smile took on a distinctly predatory edge. "Now, Marcus Chen, we hunt down the rest of the Void cult. They killed your mother and threatened the lives of billions. That requires correction." Marcus touched the pendant and felt its warm pulse of agreement. His mother had died protecting others. He would live honoring that sacrifice, using his abilities not to transcend his humanity, but to express it more fully than any single species had ever managed. "When do we start?" The Dragon Empress laughed, and the sound held all the promise of justice finally served. "Right now,"